If you're considering a career in instructional design, you might already think you know what an instructional designer does. You may be surprised, however, at some of the things you actually have to do in the real world as an instructional designer. Hey, it's Jeff with YourLearningCareer.com. Now, the purpose of this video is not to scare you away from instructional design. When you get out into the real world, it can be quite a bit different than what you may have read online or seen in a video. So I want to give you a real world perspective based on my experience. Well, let's get started. Probably one of the biggest things you need to wrap your head around when you go out into the corporate world is that it is the business that will dictate what you are working on, the type of project you are working on. I know for me, I had all these ideas of, oh, I'm going to work on this kind of training or that kind of training. And you don't usually get to just pick and choose the types of training projects you work on. If you work for a company, you're going to do what that company needs. And that's business sense. I mean, they're going to have business needs, and your role is to help fulfill those business needs. And so you're going to create training that contributes to that. And it may or may not be the kind of training that you are interested in doing. So you're not going to be doing a lot of picking and choosing or, like cherry picking the types of projects you work on. It's going to depend on what your company needs. And even if you're a freelancer, again, you're going to be at the mercy of the client. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to keep in mind, that you're not always just going to be working on these fun projects. Another aspect of instructional design that you need to be very aware of is project management. As the instructional designer, you are often going to be the project manager. That means that you're going to be responsible for things like setting the timeline and keeping the project organized, setting up interviews. And the reason I say that's been a challenge for me is because I'm a very big picture, right brain, creative type. And so project management does not come naturally to me. And that has been something that has always been a bit of a challenge. Now, I've gotten better at it over the years. I mean, I think I'm decent at it now, but I really have to work at it. Now, I mentioned interviews and setting up interviews as part of project management, and that is also part of what I call SME wrangling or presenter wrangling, depending on the kind of project that you're working on. Now, a SME is a subject matter expert, and no matter what kind of training you're working on, whether it's instructor-led, virtual or e-learning, you will most likely be working with some kind of subject matter expert, because most of the time you will not be the expert. And so I say that SME wrangling is part of the job, because there's a lot of, you have to identify the SMEs, you've got to set up the time with them, a lot of times you have to do a whole bunch of follow-up to get answers. They're not always super responsive. It just, again, it depends. Set up interviews with them. You have to take notes in the interviews, save those, maybe record the interview. So there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on with that information collection from the subject matter experts. Now, those you will deal with in any kind of training. And then if you are assigned to a project that is instructor-led training, whether it's in the classroom or if it's maybe over a webinar, a lot of classes will have multiple presenters. For example, a new employee orientation. That's one that I've done a lot of. And most of the time, if I'm involved in a new employee orientation, there are guest speakers. And so that's another wrangling job where you have to work with these different presenters. You have to get their PowerPoints from them. I usually have to do a lot of updating of those PowerPoints, because a lot of times the PowerPoint that you get from your guest speakers is not going to look the way you want it to. It'll have a whole bunch of text on it, or like some crazy small graphics where they try to cram everything onto the slide. So there's a lot of that. Updating is a big part of what you'll be doing as an instructional designer. For me, in a perfect world, what I really like is to get a project, work on that project, finish it, and be done. I tend to have a short attention span, and I really don't like to have to go back to old projects. I feel like once I'm done with a project, I want to move on to the next thing. And if you're like that, you need to know that if you work for a company, you will very likely have to revisit certain projects over and over again. Now, I mentioned new employee orientation. That's a great example because that's something, it never ends. I mean, unless the company goes out of business and never hires a new person again, if you're with a relatively large company that hires people regularly, that new employee orientation ain't going away. So you're constantly having to update slides, and then there's always people who are like, oh, we need to add this to it. So there are those kinds of courses that you're constantly updating, redoing PowerPoints, or you're looking at old PowerPoints that someone else did. So there's a lot of that. And then even with e-learning too, like for example, I was in charge of creating safety courses for compliance, mandatory safety courses for e-learning. And it was an annual thing that people did every year. And so every year I had to go in and make updates. I had to check with my SMEs and I had to make those updates. And again, as someone who would really like to just be done with a project, that can be a little tedious. So I mentioned the fact that you sometimes have to take a presenter's PowerPoint and update it, redo it, make it look nice. I find that I actually quite often get asked to make this pretty. Hey Jeff, can you make this look pretty? Hey Jeff, take this job aid and make it look pretty. So that is something, as an instructional designer, you need to know that you are expected, the expectation is that you are also a graphic designer. Now, I don't want to whine too much, but I do kind of find it a little unfair because if you were a graphic designer, let's say you studied, you got your degree in graphic design, and you got hired to a company, maybe you're in the marketing department, or you got hired by an ad agency, what have you. Nobody is going to say, oh, so-and-so's a graphic designer. Let's have them create this training for us. Like, that doesn't happen if you're a graphic designer. And yet, if I'm an instructional designer, a learning designer, someone who's, my job really, technically, my role is I'm designing the training. But more and more, the expectation for us is that we are the graphic designer as well. Now, some places might actually have a separate graphic designer who works on the graphics and things like that. But in my experience, most companies expect you to be the graphic designer as well. And it can be a little intimidating, if that's not your background. So I have mixed feelings about it because on the one hand, it kind of seems like, wow, man, why I got to do that too now? But also as a creative, I actually really enjoy that aspect. Like I like finding templates or creating things because it's fun to see it all come together. But yes, graphic design, that is something, when you're creating your portfolio, when you're showing samples of your work, that definitely is something that will be looked at by whoever is doing the hiring. Something else you might find yourself responsible for is facilitation. For most of my career, I was in jobs where I was both the trainer and the training designer. So facilitation was very much a part of my role. When I decided to go full-time into instructional design, Part of the reason was I was getting a little burnt out on the facilitation part. I thought, okay, if I go to full-time instructional design, I won't have to do any more facilitation. Well, guess what? That is not the case. Now, I do a lot less facilitation, but my point is, you may, even as a full-time instructional designer, you may be asked to do some training or facilitation. And let me give you an example. One of the classes that I'm responsible for has a lot of group activities. So because of the way the group activities are designed, they need, a lot of times the various groups need a coach, like someone from the training department. And so that's something I do quite a bit, is I jump in and I help out with the facilitation for these group activities. So that's one example. Another way you might be asked to facilitate is for train the trainer. So if you have developed, you've created some training, and then there are trainers who are actually going to do the main facilitation of it, the initial kickoff, you might need to actually facilitate a session for the trainers, right? Like a train the trainer, because they need to know how this class is supposed to run. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like, you might not think of facilitation as part of what an instructional designer does, but it has definitely come up for me in my career. And then one more thing I want to mention, because again, this is something that may not be an obvious thing that you think of when you think about becoming an instructional designer, and that is LMS Administration. LMS stands for Learning Management System. And if you are going to be creating e-learning, and actually even if you're creating mainly instructor-led, most companies use a learning management system to track the training. So as an instructional designer, you may be the one responsible for putting the training or the e-learning onto the learning management system. And I know for me, that was something at several companies I've worked for. I ended up becoming kind of the main LMS administrator, which I will tell you was not my favorite thing to be. I was fine with working within the learning management system, but once I started to become the go-to LMS person, I found that I was spending a lot of time helping other people maneuver the LMS, and I was doing less of the creative stuff that I like doing. So that's just that's what happened to me. That doesn't mean that'll happen to you. But I would expect that you will work within the learning management system in some capacity. All right, so those are some of my real world experiences as an instructional designer. If you found this helpful, give me a like. I will also put some more resources for you in the description below, so check those out. I got some articles and books that I recommend. And I will also, of course, I have videos here on the channel about instructional design. I'll link to those here, so check those out as well. I thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.